Hello, my name is Rayanne Dione, and this is my final project for my Elements of Data Science class with Professor Nicholas Marcus. For this project, I am looking at the New Hampshire flood insurance policies under the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program. This project has two research questions. The primary question is which county in New Hampshire has the highest average national flood insurance policy premium? The secondary question is whether the average flood insurance premium is higher for a pre-firm structure versus a post-firm structure. The main difference between a pre-firm and a post-firm structure is that a pre-firm was built or substantially improved before the town or city adopted its first flood insurance rate map. This means that the building was constructed before the town had detailed information on its flood hazards or had adopted building requirements to make the building more resilient to flooding. My prediction is that Rockingham County will have the highest average policy premium because it contains all of New Hampshire's coastal communities. These are the communities that are subject to tidal flooding and storm events. I also believe that pre-firm structures will have a higher premium because they weren't necessarily built with flooding in mind. So you might be wondering, what is the importance of the National Flood Insurance Program? What you might not realize is that your homeowner's insurance does not cover natural flood events and that a separate policy is needed. This is why in 1968, the U.S. Congress passed the National Flood Insurance Act, which created the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. Congress wanted to address the rising cost of flood loss and provide a mechanism for providing disaster assistance. The focus of the NFIP is to help reduce the impacts of flooding on both private and public structures. This is accomplished by providing support for the identification of local flood hazards through the adoption of floodplain management ordinances and by providing federally backed flood insurance. So how does a community decide if it should join the National Flood Insurance Program? The first thing that's important to know is that it's voluntary. There are no laws or regulations that require a community to join. The first step is to take a look at the flood insurance rate maps and see if there are portions of the community that are subject to high levels of flood risk. If that is the case, then the community could move forward with adopting a floodplain ordinance. This is a set of land use regulations and building construction requirements that are specific to the type of flood hazards. So there are different construction requirements if you're building along the ocean versus the banks of a river. The benefits of joining the program is that all of the property owners within that community are eligible for a flood insurance policy through the NFIP. The community itself also becomes eligible for most federal forms of disaster assistance and relief. Let's assume you live in a community that participates in the NFIP and that your structure is located in a flood zone. You might be wondering, what factors influence my flood insurance costs? There are four major factors. The first is the amount and type of coverage you're looking to purchase. The second is the type of flood zone your property is located in. There are some that are at higher risk of flooding than others. For example, a property that might experience high wind and high waves versus another that would experience shallow flooding. There's also the design and age of your structure. Is your elevation of your first floor of living space at or above what's called the base flood elevation, or what FEMA believes will be the level of flooding in that zone? Then there's also whether or not your building was built before or after your community first adopted its flood insurance rate maps. Since New Hampshire is the focus of this project, I thought it was important to get a feeling for the level of participation in the NFIP. So you'll see this map here, and in purple are all of the communities that participate in the NFIP. It's over 90%, or 219 communities. Also, as of April 2019, there were 8,038 active NFIP policies. For this project, I looked at two main data sources. The first was the Open FEMA data source, which is a compilation of public records from the National Flood Insurance Program. All of the data is redacted so that it protects the policyholders' private information. In this data file, there are over 50 million policy transactions. The data set is updated fairly regularly on a monthly basis. And in the file that I downloaded, there was over 1 million policies and 45 data fields per policy. All of this data was based on town name. And although that's interesting, some of the towns in New Hampshire may have only had a handful of policies. So it seemed to make sense to aggregate them based on county. Since the FEMA database didn't include that information, I looked at the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives, which is the statewide land use and planning division. It also houses a majority of the New Hampshire Bureau of Census data. So on their site, I was able to find a list of towns in each county. These are the two data sets that I linked together to perform my analysis. Before I could do any data analysis, I needed to prepare my data. So the first step was to download the FEMA NFIP dataset, which was a large CSV file. I sorted the records by state name so that I was able to just select the information for New Hampshire. For New Hampshire, there was 1,634 records. At first, I thought this seemed rather low compared to the number of active policies, which was slightly over 8,000. But upon further inspection, the files provided were policies that began in 2009 and ended in 2010 or 2011. So it is a subset of data. I then sorted the New Hampshire data by town name and then went over to the OSI website to get the town and county names. This was an HTML table, which I needed to copy and place into Excel. And then I sorted the Excel file by town name. So now I had two data sets that were sorted by town name. And what I wanted to do is just do a quick QC to make sure that all of the NFIP town names matched up with a county. And what I did find is that there were some NFIP names that were spelt slightly different than the town names in the OSI data set. For example, Northampton in the NFIP dataset, there was one instance where North was spelled out and another instance where it was just N.Hampton. So I made sure that my OSI list included all of those different variations, of which there was maybe roughly a dozen that I just had to make sure matched with a county name. Once I had these two data sets, I had my Excel file with my NFIP data in one tab, and then I added this OSI name and county in another tab in that same file. I uploaded that into Tableau, and then once it was in Tableau, I linked these two data tabs based on town name. Now that my data was in Tableau, I could calculate the average NFIP policy premium by county, and I chose to display that as a bar graph. Because I think it does a nice job of listing all the counties along the x-axis in alphabetical order, and then the average policy premium in dollars along the y. Each of the numbers at the top of the bar graph represents the number of policies in that county. As you will see, Cheshire County ends up having the highest average NFIP policy premium at $1,367.60, whereas Stratford County has the lowest average premium at $732.70. I also looked at the New Hampshire average, which is calculated by pooling all of these counties together. The New Hampshire average was $958.20, with the median just slightly lower at $937.90. Now, one of the things I thought was interesting was the fact that Rockingham County, even though it has the highest number of policies, didn't in fact have the highest average. There were actually 4 counties, Carroll, Cheshire, Grafton, and Sullivan, that had higher averages than Rockingham County. So now that we have a bit of an understanding of which counties have the highest average flood insurance policy premiums, I want to take a look at the role that pre and post firm structures play in this average. So to do this, I selected a box plot. Again, on the x-axis, we have our counties in alphabetical order. On the y, we have the average policy premium. And now we have a single dot per policy. And what's nice about a whisker plot is it really shows you the spread of your data. And so anything that's falling, any data points that are outside these upper and lower bounds, or the whiskers of the box plot, are potential outliers. So what I think is interesting is that, one, a majority of the circles that are above that upper bound are orange, so they are pre-firm buildings. So those are certainly pulling that average up. Although Rockingham County did not have the highest average, it did have the highest single policy at over $15,000. And I did take a look at that data point, and it was a structure that was actually built in 1900. What I wasn't expecting to see was post-firm structures, so the ones in green being above and potential outliers. A potential reason why they are is that maybe there has been some kind of floodplain compliance issues. Maybe these structures were built and they didn't use the proper construction methods that were required to make them more resilient to flooding. And as a result, they're not getting that lower flood insurance premium that they would have otherwise. When you move over to the summary stats, you'll see that the number of policies for pre-firm structures is almost double that of post-firm. And that could be reflective of the fact that, New England is an older area, so the structures in New Hampshire certainly predate the average time that a flood insurance rate map was accepted, which was right around the mid-1970s. So it's not that surprising that we would have a lot of structures that haven't been updated to the most current floodplain standards. What's also interesting is that the average premium for a pre-firm is about $300 greater than a post-firm. And then when you move down to the median, it's almost double for a pre-firm versus a post-firm. So this certainly shows that the pre-firm structures do have a pull on those averages and tend to be higher flood insurance policies. So now that we have an idea of which county in New Hampshire has the highest average, we've got a better idea of the role that pre and post-firm buildings play in that average policy premium. I always think it's interesting after analysis to kind of think about next steps. What would we want to do to expand upon this project? So the first thing I'd want to do is go back and see if there's more FEMA policy data available for New Hampshire. Maybe actually reach out to the data collectors for FEMA and see why it was that the data set I downloaded only had just over 1,600 records, and that it was only from the time frame of 2009 to 2011. I think there has to be more data available, and that would only make my analysis more robust. I'd also want to look at the structure's age and see how that influences the average policy premium, and whether or not that's similar to how the pre-firm and post-firm designations influenced the policy costs. I also think it would be interesting to look at the different flood zones, so break it down by flood zones and see how those average policy premiums compare to one another. I suspect, as I shared, that some flood zones are at a higher risk. Those are the ones that are getting that high energy waves, winds, kind of that more destructive storm events versus a more shallow flooding event. So I think it'd be interesting just to take a look and see if that holds true. Are those higher zones, higher risk zones, also having higher flood insurance policies? FEMA also had available flood insurance claim data, so I think it would be very interesting to see how the average flood insurance claim lines up with the premium costs and whether or not, Cheshire County also has the highest flood insurance claims, or maybe there's a different county. You could also look at how those pre and post firm structures influence the claims. Are those pre-firm, those potentially less flood resilient buildings also having the highest claims? Might be possible. Lastly, I think it would be interesting to do a New England coastal state analysis. This is just kind of taking it a step back and out and using a larger set of data. Maybe you could compare states to one another. So I think the FEMA data set has so many pieces to it that I think there are several different combinations and several different analyses that could be done that would be very, very interesting. So this is the conclusion of my presentation. It has been a really interesting project to do, one that has, I think, for me, resulted in more questions that I would like to look at and check out. So I look forward to working with this data again in the future. I hope that you found this presentation informative, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Thank you.